everyone. It's June 27th, and this is our webinar for the month. This is a series that we've been doing monthly where we address topics that are of concern to folks in the patient community in particular, and specifically within our autoimmune and systemic inflammatory syndromes collaborative research group that's part of PCORNet. PCORNet's the National Patient-Centered Clinical Research Network. Arthritis Power is the network that I'm one of the managers and leaders of, along with Jeff Curtis and Seth Ginsberg. But there are other patient-powered research networks as well for different conditions. This one in particular, this presentation tonight is being hosted and led by Arthritis Power and in collaboration with the Collaborative Research Group. And the topic is comparing the safety and effectiveness of immunomodulating therapies. This is by far our most popular topic so far of these monthly series. We had more people sign up for this than any other. So thank you all for joining us. We're delighted to see so many people out there. And we're joined today by Dr. Jeff Curtis. He is a professor of medicine at the Division of Clinical Immunology and Rheumatology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He's also a co-director of CERTS, that's the Center of Education for Education and Research on Therapeutics of Musculoskeletal Disorders, and he's also a co-director of the PEER unit, which is the Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics Research Unit. Among his research interests are the evaluation of the efficacy, comparative effectiveness, and safety of the medications used to treat rheumatoid arthritis and spondyloarthritis in particular, which is great because that's the topic for today's webinar. I believe we've worked out sort of the technology here, and we've got Dr. Curtis on the line. And just before I turn it over to Dr. Curtis, I just wanted to give a couple of kind of housekeeping details. So these webinars are scheduled for 1 hour. Typically, the presentation lasts around 30 minutes, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter. But then at the end of the presentation, we will address questions from the viewers, and I'll have a few questions as well. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please go ahead and enter them into the questions tab. I see there's already a few questions in here, which is fantastic. And we'll take those one by one at the end. Everyone is muted for now. And once we address the questions, we'll typically just keep everyone on mute, just kind of to maintain order. But if we need clarification from a comment or question, we can certainly take folks off mute. With that, I'm going to turn over the presentation and the sharing to Dr. Curtis.
So thanks very much. I'm Jeff Curtis. I'm, as Ben said, I work with the creaky joints patient community in the Arthritis Power Registry, and so I see patients and am a clinical researcher at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in the South. I'm originally from the West Coast, and I'm really excited to be part of Arthritis Power and this patient registry. I do comparative effectiveness research, and that's really the main topic for the next 20 or 30 minutes, and then some discussion and Q&A. But the part that I really am gratified to be on the phone with all of you is frankly, 5 years ago, I don't even know that I could have conceived, being on the phone or on a webinar with all of you, because the idea that, patients were active research partners was honestly kind of a foreign thing. And yet it's so critically important because the things that, patients care about, the things that patients have to teach doctors and other patients, I think are really quite critical, so that we study the most important things that people care about. And that's not always necessarily what the FDA cares about. It may not even be quite the same things that doctors care about. And so the fact that patients now can have a voice and be active research partners, not just participants, I think is really kind of a new change, and frankly a sea change compared to maybe how we used to do clinical research 5, 10, and 15 or so years ago. As Ben said, this is a collaborative effort that brings together, doctors and researchers and patients and really a lot of different stakeholders from a lot of different places. This particular presentation is done under the auspices of the Collaborative Research Group. There are 5 different patient registries that are one of the studies and 6 in total, including multiple sclerosis, that we're going to go over. And as mentioned, this one is focused on comparing safety and effectiveness. Next slide. So really just to level set, what is comparative safety and effectiveness? Next slide. And I don't know, Ben, if there's a way you can give me control of your keyboard, even if you're not making me the presenter or not, or if that's just an impossibility.
I don't think so, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So really, what is it, to level set a definition? It's really a comparison of existing healthcare interventions so that we can understand both benefit and harm. There's the potential for both benefit and harm with almost everything you do. Getting in the car has some small potential risk. You're getting in a car accident. There's basically no medicines or treatments or interventions that are without at least some potential risk. Sometimes, though, what patients and doctors alike forget about, there's also risks or potential harms if you do nothing. So the status quo is not always a risk-free prospect, and yet sometimes people forget what it means to, continue on with business as usual, to not accept a treatment. Those harms and those benefits need to be explicitly thought about as well, not choosing as a choice. And so comparative effectiveness really says, among the array of things that you could do, and that could be, I'm not going to do anything different, but that's still a choice. What's likely to happen to me? And both patients and doctors and other clinicians really want to know what treatment works best on average, but even more important, who is this treatment most likely to work best for and under what circumstances? And as I say to my own patients in clinic, I might have data for how well things work on average, but I don't care as much about what the average patient's response is. I care about what your response is going to be or what somebody like you's response is. And this is the concept of personalized or precision medicine. The idea that, it's great to know how the average patient does, but I care about, you, Mrs. Smith, and people like you. And so let's figure out, how we can personalize care consistent with your goals and values and other medical and healthcare issues, etc. So that's really the concept of personalizing medicine. Next slide. So as mentioned, this is always a balance of effectiveness and safety, and that might lead us in different directions. And not surprisingly, there is not always a right best answer. And this is really where I feel like, the job of the clinician in large part is to help interpret the best medical evidence where it exists and to help patients come to good treatment decisions consistent with their goals and values and aspirations. And, if you're so worried about the safety of a new treatment that you can barely sleep at night, and there are some that are very anxiety provoking, that's probably not the best option to inspire confidence. And usually patients aren't even going to want to stick with that long haul if they're very anxious or they don't feel they need the treatment. So I think the job of the clinician is really to help make some of that evidence interpretable and to align it best with what the patient is seeking. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be a one-size-fits-all for every patient. Next slide. So why do we care about this? Well, there's a lot of different treatment options, and some of them have some unique safety concerns attached to them. Others, it's more general, and I'll speak to that for just a bit. And again, on average, most of our medicines work pretty well for most people most of the time. And frankly, if you can't meet that bar, on average, probably the Food and Drug Administration doesn't approve the medication. So the averages are good, but we need to do something better. Next slide. So the other consideration that really has been lacking in the rheumatology and immunology and autoimmune field, how well do these medications work? And I can give you data from large randomized controlled trials, but in arthritis, say rheumatoid or psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis, the things that get measured in those trials may in fact not be the things that patients care about. And I would argue that what patients care about is probably as or more important than whatever the FDA thinks is important or a doctor thinks is important, because people living with the disease are most affected by it. So how well the medicines work depends a little bit on, well, what are you measuring? So for example, if you have rheumatoid arthritis, let's say, you're a 35-year-old person who's living with RA, and, you've got 10 tender and swollen joints, that's a big deal. That's going to affect pain and function, whether you can take care of children if you have children, do the things you enjoy doing, go to work. Most patients care about pain and function and mobility. Fatigue usually rates pretty highly. The FDA doesn't actually care about those things as a first priority. They care about tender and swollen joints. They care about lab tests. Again, to get a drug approved, those are some of the accepted outcomes, but often that's not how doctors, and certainly not how patients, are going to find the highest value. They're going to more care about pain or function. There's not necessarily a definitely more right than the other, but from a patient's perspective, mostly patients want to say, well, give me data, give me evidence for the things I value, and that's not how many swollen joints I have, except that it affects my pain and function. And this is really how patient communities and a patient registry like Arthritis Power and some of the others, I think has a huge amount to contribute, because there's very little data about how well patients are feeling in health domains that matter most to them. Next slide. The other thing that's important to consider, and we've gotten a lot of patient feedback, often it's a little bit obscure to know how well some of the medicines that we use work. Medicines that affect the immune system do not work instantaneously. This is not, a pain medicine, an ibuprofen or a Norco or something where if it works, you're going to feel better an hour or two later. Things might take a few weeks or even a couple months to really work and to get to the right dose. And that's something that we heard over and over from patients, that how long it takes these treatments to work over a few weeks and months, sometimes is not very clear to them as they're talking to their doctor, yet that's really important. What would be very burdensome is if you had to go back to the doctor every single week, say for 3 or 4 months, to know how quickly a treatment would work. But if you're in a typical randomized controlled trial, you would really have to have a study visit every week for the first 12 or 16 or 24 weeks to know how quickly something worked. And frankly, most people just don't want to do that because you have a real life. So there's not a whole lot of data with once-a-week visits because it's too burdensome. But if you have a smartphone in your pocket, you could actually record once a week for 8 or 10 or 12 minutes at a time, and thus the capacity of the Arthritis Power and some of the other registries to fill in the gap to know how quickly things are working, where you're just not going to go back for a traditional study visit where it involves a bunch of travel, but you might be willing to contribute data on your smartphone. Next slide. And so this is really something that Ben and folks in the creaky joints patient community led as part of an educational survey where we basically asked many of you, and some of you perhaps even listening to this, what is most important to you to study and to learn from a patient community perspective, and comparative effectiveness and safety was really in the top 2 concerns. And so this is where we canvassed the whole patient community and said, well, what's important to you that we would study? And this is generally number 1 or number 2, depending upon how people ranked it by and large. So again, the point of having a patient research community where we say, let's go study the things that matter most to patients. And so patients were asked, and I think 400 or 500 people or so responded, and this was, I think, the number 1 or 2 thing that folks wanted answered. Next slide. So there's a lot of different choices. This is not exhaustive, but just to give you a sense, in the year 2018, what biologic or targeted synthetic disease-modifying drugs are used to treat rheumatoid or psoriatic arthritis or psoriasis or spondyloarthritis? There's Enbrel, there's Remicade, there's Humira, there's Simponi, there's Cimzia, there's Xeljanz, there's Otezla, there's Rituxan, there's Orencia, there's Kevzara, there's Actemra, there's Stelara, there's Cosentyx, and there's Taltz. There's obviously a bunch of different therapies we could use. There's more than this, but the ones that you are on or may have seen TV ads for, etc., are probably on this list. And this isn't even all rheumatic conditions and musculoskeletal conditions. The list would be much, much longer if I gave you, the similar list for lupus or gout or fibromyalgia or osteoarthritis or osteoporosis or, Crohn's, etc. So this list goes on and on. So the point is, there's a whole lot of choices out there, and there isn't enough money and time in the world to do a head-to-head randomized controlled trial comparing every one of these against every other one of these in huge numbers of patients. That's just never going to happen. And that's the point of joining a patient registry, is that large numbers of patients who are actually trying these as a matter of due course as part of their routine care can actually inform the other members of the patient community how well they're doing. And so we can do these kinds of comparisons in a way that you'll never have head-to-head trial data for every single comparison, even for the ones that are on this list. Next slide. So the other consideration is, as a member of a patient community, we really want to know how well things are working for you. And this is where, even though there might be 15,000 people that are in arthritis power, if you're a 70-year-old diabetic African-American man with rheumatoid arthritis, somebody like you probably wants to know about your journey and your experience. And that's where, every single patient has a voice and contributes to the whole of this. And our goal is to really help personalize care based on evidence. And that's where everybody's unique history, is incredibly valuable, because there's almost certainly someone else out there that is not quite as far in their journey with their health condition as you might be. And so this is where your experience can contribute uniquely. Next slide. So what we're talking about contributing, and what those of you that are part of one of the registries, Arthritis Power or the IBD Partners Registry or the Children Registry for Musculoskeletal Disease or the Vasculitis Registry, a lot of what you may be contributing, if you're one of those, is called a patient-reported outcome, or a PRO. So this is just really, what is your experience with a medication, a treatment, etc. So when I use that abbreviation PRO, that's really what we're talking about. And I think as time has evolved, and the FDA and industry and companies that make treatments, they're starting to pay attention now that there is the possibility that we can collect data from patients about how well they're doing. So both the capacity and the opportunity, I think, are well aligned, but even regulators like the FDA are starting to pay attention. And some medications have PRO label claims, meaning the medicine has been shown or proven with very high quality evidence to, improve how patients are feeling, not just how many joints were tender or swollen, or, what somebody with colitis might have on a colonoscopy as an outcome. Next slide. So this is really where every patient and member of the community participating makes a big deal. And we understand that contributing PRO data over time, does require a bit of a time commitment, but this is where it really matters. Next slide. The other thing that I think is very important, that I've spent more of my career in recent years trying to build tools around, you can generate lots of evidence, but if you don't have the ability to effectively communicate that evidence, first to doctors and clinicians and then to patients in a manner that is effective, that makes sense, it's not going to go very far, and it kind of falls flat. Next slide. One of the ways that we do this, and there's a couple ways you could do this in clinic, but we use a tablet app. So patients in my clinic and that of my colleagues are contributing how they're doing on a tablet. And if we're talking about a new medication, we have a way to visually depict the likelihood that a new treatment might help somebody feel better. And so, for example, this is what's called an icon array. The idea that, 60% of people, or 60 out of 100, those are the blue people, are likely to get improvement. So, for example, if I'm starting a new drug like Humira or Enbrel, the proportion of people that would feel quite a bit better from large, high-quality randomized trials is about 60%. Again, that's the average, and you're you, and I care more about you and people like you, but I'd rather have some information than nothing. So this is the likelihood that if you started a new biologic for the first time for your psoriasis or your rheumatoid or whatever condition we're talking about, about 60% of people, maybe 70% for some therapies, are going to do quite well. Next slide. People then will say, well, fine, but show me safety. Here is the safety profile of some of the drugs I just described. About 5 out of 100 people would have a serious infection, like a pneumonia, for example, or a skin infection that might land them in the hospital. An infection that would be pretty clinically relevant, that you might be hospitalized for a couple days. So it's 5 out of 100. The other 95 out of 100 people over the course of a year didn't have a serious infection. And so the intent is to really, give people some visual depiction, the likelihood they might get better with the treatment, the likelihood that, something bad would happen. Next slide. And so some of my patients say, well, I get what pneumonia is like. I have a feel for that. But, what about rare side effects? And this is really the risk for something bad like tuberculosis. It's 2 out of about 1,000 people starting, Enbrel or Humira or one of those drugs. Is this risk 0? No, but it's pretty teeny tiny. And so, 998 people in this did not get tuberculosis, and it's only the 2 out of 1,000 in red that did develop tuberculosis. But what's sometimes misleading is when doctors communicate evidence, they'll say the risks are low, or it's uncommon, or it's rare. And the problem is that, what you envisioned when I say the word rare or uncommon or the risk is low is not what I might envision or what the next person envisions. So if you have no context for that, then you have no idea if it's 2 out of 1,000 or 2 out of 100 or 2 out of 10. Just for the heck of it, I've asked a couple of patients, I get that you saw the TV ad or the commercial, ballpark what you think the risk for tuberculosis is with this new drug that's kind of worrying you. Invariably, I have people tell me, they think the risks are about 5 or 10%. So that would be about 10 out of 100. And in fact, the reality is it's more like what I'm showing you on the screen. It's not 10 out of 100 or 10% like people are thinking. It's 2 out of 1,000, a risk dramatically lower. But again, if you have no visual feel or no way to contextualize that, and your doctor just says, well, the risk is low, who knows what that really means? I mean, nobody could know that. And so this is one of the kinds of tools that we use in our clinic and that we are bringing to Arthritis Power to be able to communicate this sort of information effectively. Next slide. So what could you do to help? So if you've already joined the Arthritis Power Registry or the Vasculitis Registry or the IBD Crohn's and Colitis Registry, you're probably already helping. And it's really when you contribute regular data that makes all of this possible. Next slide. So the key things, and frankly the things that I would plead with the patient community to consider and to keep updated is to tell us how you're doing in terms of your medications. So, ideally you want to know how well someone is doing or how well they're not doing at the time they start a new treatment. And then once a month, if you contributed data, 10 minutes, just say, how am I doing before I start the medicine, and then a month later and a month after that, so that you're sharing your experience with the patient community. All of the registries track that information, and then that information can be used to help other people, not in an identifiable way that anyone knows that it's you, but just so that we understand how well you're getting and how quickly you're getting better, or if the medicine frankly just didn't work too well. I can tell you that in Arthritis Power, not even 50% of people have filled out all of their arthritis medications, much less any others. So unfortunately, that data has more limited use for any other patients' benefit that are really seeking to understand whether, treatment X or treatment Y might be better for someone like them. Next slide. So research opportunities within Arthritis Power. Next slide. There's a couple that I want to mention. One of them is this one. Next slide. And we're really looking at two things. One of them is to look at what is the risk side, and we're looking at different treatments like the ones I put on a couple of slides ago. Next slide. The second is maybe even more salient, and this is the bit that we're really groundbreaking here as a patient community and partners. How well do any of these medicines work for your fatigue, for your sleep, for your pain, for your ability to work with family or to work or hang out with family and friends and do the things you like doing? Nobody has this data. We're really among the very first ever to be able to collect this over time. That's this research study. Now, I've described it research opportunities within Arthritis Power. What that really means is that Arthritis Power is the registry. That's what hopefully many, if not most of you, have joined, or the IBD or the Vasculitis Registry. And what I think of that is it's a light touch registry. You've told people through the registry a little bit about yourself. Let's say you have rheumatoid arthritis and you're a certain sex and age, but when there's something that comes along that you're excited about and want to contribute to the patient community like this, how well do these medicines work, this is something where for a period of time, 3, 4, 6 months or something, you could contribute 10 or 15 minutes of data once a month. That's what the ask is. So that's what I'm describing as a research opportunity as part of the registry. And then maybe that ends after 3 or 6 months. And then, there's not much time commitment until the next thing that sparks your interest. So the idea is it allows you to be part of something, but then when there's a focused opportunity that seems to generate your interest, then you can be part of that. Next slide. So this is kind of what it would look like. So we would love to have data at least once a month. And so what I put on the top line, every time that there is an X, is when you think of using your smartphone or connecting to the Arthritis Power app on your Android or your iPhone or the web app through the internet. Right now the data that gets entered is a little bit catch as catch can. Some people frankly download the app, they spend 10 minutes with it, and they never log on again. And so you know nothing about how they're doing over time, and there's not as much you can do with that data if what you want to know is how well does a treatment work over time. What we'd love it to look like is the line on the bottom. When you change treatments, you start a new medicine or you stop a new medicine. Maybe you're doing great, and you say, I don't need these 3 medicines. Maybe I peel back the third medicine, maybe that's steroids or something else that you don't want to be on or you and your doctor think you don't maybe need. It would be great to know something about once a month about how well that works, because as people are doing well and in remission or close to it, they're starting to peel back treatments. If somebody gets worse, that's not going to happen immediately, and yet that's why we need data over time. And if that was spaced out once a month, say for 3 to 6 months, as shown in this picture, that's the kind of information that is incredibly valuable to be able to inform and educate other members of the patient community. Next slide. So if you're already a member of Arthritis Power or one of the other registries, that's fantastic. We're going to mention this choice study to know once a month for 10 or 12 minutes a month, how well you're doing, especially at the time that you change treatments. Next slide. However, if you're already part of Arthritis Power and if you're contributing data with regularity, we're basically in a soft launch. So you're already helping out and you're already contributing. So we very much appreciate that. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a minority of people that have provided medication data and then contribute data even just once a month over time. But that's the point, and that's how it's being used in this particular analysis to help other patients, make informed decisions about how well treatments might work for them. And if enough members of the patient community are part of this, and clearly we have enough members, it's more of a willingness issue, then we're going to have great data. But if people give up after a month or two, then that obviously compromises the whole effort from patients. Next slide. So I mentioned a couple others of things that are coming up just to give you a sense about, well, what else is being done to look at comparative effectiveness and safety. So somebody, Dr. Mike George, who is at University of Pennsylvania, has proposed a study. It's really an analysis of Arthritis Power registry data, looking at steroids like prednisone or Medrol, and looking at, how well steroids help, both good and bad. Bad might be infections or weight gain. If you stop steroids, maybe that helps you lose weight, etc. But we know steroids work pretty quickly, so there's kind of a love-hate relationship. Next slide. Another of our colleagues, Dr. Iris Navarro at the Hospital for Special Surgery, she's very interested in helping people understand that if you have rheumatoid or psoriatic arthritis, your risk of a heart attack or stroke is about 50% increased. And she's really working with the Arthritis Power patient community to help people gain control with their doctors to manage their cardiovascular risk factors, cholesterol, blood pressure. That can include diet or lifestyle. Sometimes it includes medications, but not always, to reduce that extra heart attack and stroke risk back to the general population. Next slide. And then a third project that Ben and others in Global Healthy Living are leading is to understand how sleep and pain and fatigue, all relate to one another. If I overdo it physical activity-wise, here's what happens the next day, or if I get good sleep or bad sleep, or if I change my exercise regimen, then what happens? So these are just additional studies that are being launched within the Arthritis Power Registry that if you're part of these or if you're contributing data with regularity, particularly for the last one, that really informs, how other people might understand their own health condition and the insights that can bring. Next slide. So a couple enhancements, and Ben just advanced through this a couple times. I listed a few things that we've gotten a lot of feedback from the patient community around, how can we make this better? When many of us, including, patient partners and what we call the patient governors, essentially the patient steering committee that helps guide what we're doing and how we're doing it, we want to continually make this better. The main audience for the Arthritis Power Registry and the app is not researchers. It's certainly not the FDA. It's not drug companies. It's patients. If this registry isn't useful for patients, then it's missed the mark, because the main goal and the main audience about whose needs need to be served is patients. Yes, it should help doctors, and it should help everybody else, researchers and academics and the FDA, et cetera. But the main thing that we care about is we care about doing useful things that help patients take control of their disease effectively. So some of the things that we've heard as feedback from the patient community, we want better ways to see our own data. So I'm calling that data visualization, and to compare with other people with your health condition. If you're a 70-year-old woman with rheumatoid arthritis, then we want to be able to show you, again, not in an identifiable way, but how you're doing compared to other 70-year-olds with rheumatoid arthritis, not the average patient. There's a new study at certain sites where there's a compatible electronic health record that would allow your data to directly flow into your doctor's electronic health record, or EHR. We're not going to do that. We would never do that without asking you. We're not going to send your data anywhere else. But if you want your doctor to directly have your data, and he or she has an electronic health record that can accept this, some but not all do, then we want to make that really easy so your doctor and you can effectively partner, so he or she can take the best care of you in a more holistic way, not just a few times a year that you might go to the rheumatologist office, but every time that you put in data to the Arthritis Power app. And then later on in the year, we're bringing in, Fitbit and health activity tracker data. Many of you, including me, and I have arthritis as well, wear something on your wrist that actually does a pretty good job of keeping track of mobility and sleep. And that will be part of the kinds of data that we can use. So it doesn't always have to be answering questions, but, if you're having an arthritis flare, it probably is recorded in a passive way through things that, we wear regularly. And so that can be incorporated for the benefit of the patient community and anonymized, and then it's not always filling out questionnaires. Next slide. So with that, hopefully I've run the gamut of really the focus on comparing effectiveness and safety, and we're really crowdsourcing lots of patients' journeys and experiences so we can deliver personalized information. And obviously none of this can happen without patient research partners that are helping direct and participate in everything that's happening. So none of this is possible without the many fantastic people that are involved, but mostly you all that are part of this. And I myself am a user of the Arthritis Power Registry too. So we would love to hear from you. And frankly, I think we've tried as much as possible to be responsive. For those of the 3,000 of you that were using version 1.0 of the app, we thank you for your graciousness in sticking with us. The thing that we heard the most is, basically, we really don't like the medication system. And although, you have 15 arthritis and psoriasis medicines, we want to be able to record everything that we're on. So we actually completely scrapped the whole medication module and rebuilt it from scratch because you all said, do better and try harder. And then the next round was, good job with that, but it's too complicated. You've given us too many choices. So in fact, in the next month or so, we're releasing a new version of the app that makes it even simpler. And then we'll give a limited set of reasons without being too complicated, why you're switching treatment. So this is the part where we really do care about and value your feedback and look at each and every comment that comes through. So thank you again, and I'd love to take any comments or questions that any of you may have.
Thanks very much, Dr. Curtis. This was great, very interesting, and a nice overview just to help us understand, get a working definition of what's meant by effectiveness versus safety and what's meant by comparative effectiveness and so on. And I also appreciate the encouragement to folks in our community to kindly heckle us about the Arthritis Power Network and Registry. So a couple of questions have appeared here in our question window. So I'll kind of start with the order that makes the most sense by referring to a question about the studies that you mentioned, including the CHOICE study. The question here from Carol about patient incentives. Are there patient incentives included in any of those studies with CHOICE, with Mike George's or Iris's study or the exercise tracking study? I know I can answer at least some of that, but I guess let's start with CHOICE.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably answer this as well as I could, but any study that requires more than a trivial time commitment, we believe in compensating people for their time. So that will have patient compensation available. We asked patients, and in fact, for the several patient communities that were part of it, people have somewhat different feelings about whether that's a good idea or not. Where I think everyone is appropriately cautious is if it feels like it's too transactional. You're buying my data. That is, in fact, a bad perception and, frankly, not accurate. Then it sort of feels like, blood donation, and that to some people feels a little bit creepy or just, very transactional. The point of this is to really help members of the patient community to not be too bothersome. But yes, for everything basically that requires more than just a couple minutes of your time, and CHOICE would be no exception, we do want to recognize and really say thank you to compensate people for their time, but to avoid any perception that somehow this is a business transaction, because it's not. This is really helping other members of the patient community. This data doesn't get sold. This isn't going to marketers. It doesn't, get licensed to drug companies or things like that. So, but yes, patients are compensated for their time. There'll be other patient communities that are part of it, not Arthritis Power. They feel like they want to avoid anything that feels overly business transactional wise, and that for their community that's not such a good idea. And so for that reason, we're respectful of how individual patient communities that are part of this have decided that they feel it best serves the needs of their members, having asked them and having patients weighed in and made final decisions.
For these other studies, I know Mike George's study will include an incentive. I believe Iris's will too. The one on Arthritis Power exercise tracking, as far as I know, we don't have a financial incentive for participation. I think that's mainly because it includes kind of the regularly scheduled program within Arthritis Power, just the addition of another measure. But we'll see how that goes. And I think, Carol, your question also included other types of incentives like points or reward, some kind of a reward system. Those developments are in the works, and as you know, Carol, have been for years, but I think we don't have those. They're not implemented yet, and I'm not sure they will be for these particular studies. But I think,
and this is where, if people would value that, if that feels useful to them, we would love to know that. I think we have the sense that some people would find that of value, but it may not be everybody. But if you think that would be a good idea, that a reward system or incentivization, should sort of be part and parcel of everything that's done, we'd love to know that and to hear from you about that. But as you said, for the bottom one, this is really not a whole lot more than regular participation in Arthritis Power entails. The idea with that study, just to give your study a 30-second plug, if you have diabetes and you record your blood sugar and you record what you eat and how much you exercise, you have a good sense, probably, if you're recording it in a paper log, about how what you eat and how you exercise affects your blood sugar. This is the same idea in arthritis. How your activity, your sleep, etc., how all of that is interrelated. And so it's really the concept of the quantified self. When I do this, here's how I feel. When I do this today, here's how I sleep tonight, here's how I feel tomorrow. That's the concept for it. And so because it was really intended for people to bring insights to their own healthcare, and frankly, there's no funding explicitly for that, I think that was part of the thinking why that one isn't necessarily compensated.
Yeah, exactly. Another question too, more general from Amy, comes from Amy about the app itself. And she said actually she didn't even know there was an iPhone app for this. so there is, and actually, that's great feedback for us. I had no idea that anyone did not know there wasn't the smartphone capability for this to download and participate in Arthritis Power that way. And she asks, will there be a push email as a reminder to fill out or participate in these studies for choice and the other one? So yes, those haven't officially launched yet. So any of the studies that we're launching will send out emails to people who are eligible. It would also be posted in Arthritis Power. And in some of these upcoming studies, we are going to be doing additional kinds of mechanisms to remind people using a lock screen notification in addition to an email. So you'll be prompted once you're participating in a study. You may get reminders via email or by phone within the lock screen notification on your phone to complete your PROs for that month. I'm going to move on to some other questions. Oh, here's another app question. Will there be anything added that allows us to give specific data? For example, I have rheumatoid lung disease too, but the site really doesn't ask anything about special circumstances like this. Jeff, do you have any thoughts about that? Or
yeah, no, that's a great point. And we've honestly avoided other comorbidities or other health conditions a little bit because our hope is we have enough patients using this and who frankly want to tell their doctors about it, and that their doctors will allow their electronic health records to be connected to Arthritis Power, again, with your permission and with your doctor's permission. That information is almost certainly in the doctor's electronic health record. We never ever want to bug patients for data that their doctor has, and if we can link to it, because frankly that's not a good use of your time to have to re-enter that if that's already in his or her system and it can just be linked to. That said, yeah, I think the lung disease associated with many of our rheumatology conditions, rheumatoid and the muscle disease myositis and scleroderma and Sjogren's and maybe lupus, that's a big deal. And I do think that although we don't have a study right now that's launching in that is really a high priority area, and we're actually looking at some sensor devices that might be able to track that. But, if that's a high priority for patients that would like to track their breathing, there certainly are questionnaires or surveys and some new fancy sensors that can track those things. So, tell us that that's important to you, and I think we can make some concerted efforts to develop that.
A question from Larita, and I can answer this question. Larita writes, I lead an arthritis support group, RA for RA and PSA. Is it appropriate to invite people to join, or is there a selection process? So Larita, shoot me an email in that email in that last slide here, the Arthritis Power feedback slide, feedback at arthritispower.org, and we can follow up about that. I think it's Arthritis Power at its foundation is a research app, a research registry. It's a patient-centered research app. So as Dr. Curtis mentioned earlier, it was designed with the patient community in mind to make it useful. So you could enter data, do your own symptom tracking, keep track of medications there. And I actually, with my background as a social worker, have always wanted to do a study that follows a group who's participating in a support group and use the app for that kind of symptom tracking, because there are other measures, not just the ones we've listed, pain and fatigue and so on, but there's some mental health and social health measures as well. So if that's what you're talking about, potentially working together to involve people in a support group and in research, then we can talk about that. So let's follow up with each other offline about that. It sounds really interesting, and that's great to hear that there's other support groups out there. All right.
Ben, we might also mention, one of the people that we work with at UMass, so she does work with social media communities, particularly around weight loss. And as people may or may not know, if you can lose a modest amount of weight, so 10 or 15 pounds, most people's hip and knee arthritis will feel better. So she works with social support groups and uses social media to be able to help encourage people with the support of a patient community. And I think I personally have learned a lot from her. You know, if you're struggling with weight loss and that affects arthritis and probably other things, diabetes, etc., that may not be something you really want to be forthcoming with your friends and family about, or your spouse, for reasons that are probably obvious. But a support group may be helpful to you, and that's where, you know, if this feels like it's intriguing to you, we would love to collaborate or partner around that. There's some parts of the app that we've started to build out thinking, well, maybe patients might want this in the future. But again, you're getting the flavor. If you want something, we need to know about it so that we can help prioritize that. One of the things that that she's done, or at least thought of, is geofencing. And the idea is if you're in a place that might otherwise be somewhere that you need to, or that you should avoid if you're trying to lose weight, you could get encouragement from the members of your support community, like part of Arthritis Power. So for example, you know, geofencing would know if you're near a McDonald's or a Dunkin' Donuts or Krispy Kreme. You know, one of the things she's doing is she sort of crowdsources with her community that if somebody is around that environment, that they get nearly instant feedback to basically help motivate them to stay away from those areas. The Arthritis Power app doesn't do that, but it's something that we thought about if there was enough interest to do that. Obviously, to turn that on has to have your permission, and there would need to be a defined purpose. But I think that's a great example where somebody could help motivate you in real time and just send you a brief note of encouragement if you're in a place like that that, you know, is inconsistent with your long-term goals of weight loss.
Susan asked, there's someone named Susan who asked about gout, shedding some light on gout. And actually, Susan, I'll direct you to last month's webinar, which was all about gout. And I think that's posted. If not, we'll post it soon. And we did a lot more on that last month. But I'm going to ask you kind of stack a couple of questions here that are all related. And I think that this question comes from Diane. And I think it reflects a lot of what people experience when they get a diagnosis and they're trying to navigate treatments. She says, I am newly diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. My second appointment is this Thursday. I have not started any medications yet. I have been in for over 2 months. I've been researching some, but I'm just confused. What are the best options out there today? And then kind of related questions. What do you think about adipose stem cell treatment? Someone else named Diane asked about that. Adipose stem cell treatment for RA and other autoimmune diseases. Someone else asked about, mentioned the side effect they had on Remicade and wondered if you had heard of any other people who'd had that, a tumor on a pituitary stalk from Remicade infusion. So I guess, and then another related question, well, I'll stop there. So in general, though, this question about the confusion, what are the best options out there? I'm sure as a rheumatologist, you're asked that often in clinic, and how do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would respond is just to remind people, if you have an autoimmune condition or an inflammatory condition, rheumatoid or psoriatic arthritis or psoriasis or Crohn's or colitis, etc., you know, if you're not treating the immune system, you're not really treating the underlying problem. You could use pain medicines and you'll probably feel better that day, but your disease will be just as bad the next day and the day after and 10 years later. And people have, you know, often suffer irreparable harm. So lots of times people are skittish in general about medications that affect the immune system. The encouraging thing, though, is, you know, it's affecting the immune system that can actually help people get into remission or close to it. And if you're not using a medicine to affect the immune system, you're not even really treating the underlying problem. You're just treating symptoms. And while that's not a bad part of treatment, it shouldn't be only a part of treatment, the only part of treatment. With respect to some of the others, you know, 4 more minutes is not going to do justice to this versus that. Clearly, there's some educational resources available on the Arthritis Power website. A website that we stood up that has most of the rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis biologics is at RA MedGuide, short for rheumatoid arthritis medguide.com. So www.ramedguide. That provides some information. There's, no industry affiliation attached to it. It's just intended to be a realistic appraisal of risks and benefits, and I think is a nice complement to what you might learn from your doctor or other healthcare team or other resources. Ben, are you still there?
Yeah, sorry about that. Talking on mute. If it's not ramedguide.com, it's ramedguide.net, I think. Anyways, another question, and I think we're going to have to wrap up here in just a second. But someone expresses frustration about the fact that they were on something for their psoriatic arthritis that was working well, and then they had to change to a different drug. And expresses some frustration about the insurance company, feeling like the insurance company is deciding which drug will work for them rather than, regardless of what the doctor and the patient had already worked out what worked best. What are your thoughts about that in terms of how that bumps up against comparative effectiveness or the importance of comparative effectiveness in safety research?
Yeah, this, in my mind, is one of the most compelling reasons why we need registries like Arthritis Power. I can tell you as a doctor, insurance companies don't really care what I think. They care about what I think far less than they care about what you think. At least, patients pay the premiums, or their employers pay part of, if not much of, their health insurance premiums, but they really don't care about what doctors think. The perspective of the insurance companies is, on average, pretty much all these treatments work about the same, and the safety profile seems similar enough. And because there's not good, large-scale, high-quality data from large numbers of patients, maybe there's a trial of 1 or 2 or 300 people comparing this versus that, and sometimes those comparisons are against placebo, pretend medicine, sugar water. That's not a relevant comparison. You're not going to prescribe placebo to a patient. So, if there's no head-to-head data from any trial, or the trials are little, or, 80% of the patients were from outside of the U.S. and may have no idea how well that relates to anybody in the U.S., then they're going to say, well, because you guys as a field of rheumatology, not patients, not doctors, not researchers, because you can't really give us any meaningful data to know what's better or what's safer, then we'll just go with the cheapest thing, and then nobody gets any choices. They get to choose. The way to combat that, though, is to go generate that data and be able to say, for this kind of a patient or with this medical background, this treatment is better than another treatment. And we have a little bit of evidence. For example, if you're not on methotrexate, there are some treatments that definitely work better than other treatments. There's not many things I can say with that level of confidence, but that's one example where only very recently could we say that with any confidence. But this is where we really need data, and data about outcomes that patients care about, to combat that notion. And if we don't, then insurance company will just keep choosing for all of us, and neither doctors nor patients will get to choose anything.
Great. So that's another plug for why it's so important to participate in this kind of research and a network like this. One last question to end on that's come up a few times in other discussions. It's a question about, is anyone studying CBD or medical marijuana for pain relief and arthritis? I think, maybe not just medical marijuana, but other treatments, when people find that for them personally, kind of an N of 1 study, it greatly relieves some of their symptoms. That makes a difference for them. I guess, what are your thoughts about those kinds of, complementary or alternative medicines or other remedies that people might be trying, and where that fits into comparative effectiveness and safety?
Yeah, so it definitely fits into comparative effectiveness and safety. The branch of the National Institute of Health that funds a lot of medical research has a branch for complementary and alternative medicine that would include, medical marijuana and a number of other treatments. There's not a whole lot of our taxpayer dollars that actually go to fund that. They can't fund very many studies. To my knowledge, there really are not great, high quality, large scale studies of it. Do I believe that many people are benefited by that? Yeah, but can I give you a well done trial or study that would show that? No. But if there were enough people within Arthritis Power or the other registries represented on this call that actually told us how they're doing at the time they started that and entered that into the app and then told us how they're doing over time, then we'd be able to generate that evidence. And although we've been talking about entering your medications, what we've been describing as the medication module isn't only limited to medicine. So if you're on marijuana, be it street or prescription, whatever, then tell us about that. You can enter that. Nobody else is going to see it, not your doctor, certainly not anybody else that you wouldn't want it shared with explicitly. But, if enough people within the patient community are doing that, then we'd be able to share those experiences and compare it to other things. And I think that would be incredibly beneficial to tell other people about it. And it's just the willingness of the patient community to be open and to share that information in a protected environment like Arthritis Power.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Curtis, for your time with this discussion, for this webinar. And I think it's an important topic. As you mentioned, it's clearly an area of kind of the utmost importance for folks in our community to understand how well various medications work compared with each other and how quickly they work compared with each other. So for everyone out there, we'll we're recording this and we'll post it up on our website with a little context in the near future. And just a reminder too that the website that Dr. Curtis mentioned, where you can look at various different information about RA treatments, is on ramedguide.com. And we'll include that too in our write-up of this. So thanks very much for your participation, everyone, today. And please send us, as this last slide says here, send us any feedback, comments, suggestions, kind heckling at feedback@arthritispower.org. And we will stay tuned for next month's webinars. We'll send you information in the coming weeks. Thanks very much. Good night.